Welcome to this Soundscape Books recording of The Legacy Society, a gripping Boston detective thriller by Vivienne Black, presented as an exclusive audiobook. Like and subscribe for more. Enjoy. The Legacy Society, Chapter 1. The Still Water and the Spark.
The crystal chandeliers of the Beacon Hill ballroom glittered, 1,000 tiny suns that did little to warm the chill that had begun to coil deep in Marcus's gut. Detective Marcus Hall, a dark, quiet anchor in a room full of bobbing yachts, found his gaze drifting from the ornate ceiling to the faces below, searching for the shadows he knew lurked beneath the polished smiles. The familiar, dull throb behind his eyes was a more constant companion than any of these glittering strangers. He watched Senator Vance glide by, her smile practiced, her handshake firm. Across the room, Richard Sterling, the titan of Sterling Capital, held court by a marble column, his laughter echoing a little too loudly. Marcus wondered if the caterers ever got to eat any of the tiny, expensive appetizers. This was Boston's upper crust, a world of inherited influence and impenetrable networks, where consequences often felt like a rumor, not a certainty. The hum of polite conversation, the clinking of champagne flutes, the quiet whispers of power brokers, it all felt like a well-rehearsed play. A play Marcus had no desire to join. His presence here, a reluctant duty to a police foundation event, felt less like participation, and more like an intrusion. A stark reminder of the city's dual nature, the glittering facade, and the grimy realities he navigated daily. Then, a ripple. A hushed conversation started near the bar, quickly spreading like a cold current through the room. Heads turned, faces shifting from polite smiles to concerned frowns. Marcus saw a woman's hand fly to her throat, fingers digging into a string of pearls, her face suddenly pale beneath the careful makeup. Another whispered frantically into a phone. He caught a fragment of a name, Sterling, and a word, drowned. The next morning, the sterile fluorescent lights of the Boston Police Department felt like a welcome antidote to the gala's opulence, though the lukewarm coffee in his mug did little to help. Marcus sat across from Captain Davies, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee, the kind that tasted like regret. He'd skipped breakfast again, and his stomach rumbled faintly. He hoped Davies hadn't heard. Chloe Sterling, Davies stated, his voice flat. 30 years old, found in the back bay. Looks like an accidental drowning. He pushed a thin file across the desk. Marcus didn't need to open it. He could already feel the weight of the official narrative pressing down, heavy and unyielding. Family's powerful. Davies continued, his gaze pointed. They want this handled quickly, quietly, no fuss. Marcus's gaze lingered on the file photo. A vibrant woman with intelligent eyes, a life cut short. He knew that look in Davies's eyes. The unspoken pressure to rubber stamp the official narrative, to make it all disappear. Lena Petrova, Marcus's partner, sat beside him, already flipping through the preliminary report with a pragmatic sigh. Rough break for the Sterling family, she murmured, almost to herself. Then, louder, a hint of something cynical in her tone. Though, honestly, you live like that, you expect? Well, never mind. She caught Marcus's eye, a flicker of understanding passing between them, a shared weariness, before she refocused on the page. The case was officially theirs, the conclusion already written. Marcus was about to ask Davies if he'd ever seen a case this neatly tied up, when the captain's phone buzzed, a low, insistent vibration against the desk. Davies glanced at it, then at Marcus, and the air in the room seemed to thicken, no longer just stale coffee. Soon after, they were at the Back Bay waterfront, usually bustling with joggers and dog walkers, now cordoned off. The brownstones lining the street, usually so stately, seemed to shrink under the grey morning sky. The air was crisp, carrying the briny scent of the harbour. First responders had recovered Chloe Sterling's body hours ago, but the scene still held a chilling residue. Marcus walked the perimeter slowly, his eyes missing nothing, even as Lena methodically documented the official findings. The initial report cited a fall, perhaps a slip on the slick stone embankment, leading to accidental drowning. But Marcus saw things the first responders, focused on recovery, might have overlooked: the way the water had settled on the cobblestones, forming specific patterns that didn't quite align with a simple, violent splash. The undisturbed state of a nearby planter, a single red leaf caught on its edge, seemingly untouched by any struggle. "No signs of a fight, Marcus," Lena noted, glancing up from her notepad, her voice echoing the report's certainty. "Looks like she just fell in." Marcus knelt, his fingers tracing a faint, almost imperceptible scuff mark on the stone, higher than it should have been for a simple stumble. He noted the meticulous state of her clothing, then saw a small, folded note tucked beneath a loose cobblestone. It read, "Chloe didn't fall. She was about to expose Sterling Capital's fraud. Look for the old money." The words were a jolt, a sudden, bright flash in the murky mess of the case. A knot tightened in Marcus's stomach, cold and hard. He reread the words, and the dread, sharp and sudden, began to morph into something else. A stubborn, familiar refusal to let things lie. Sterling Capital. Richard Sterling. The name, the power, the inherited wealth. It clicked into place with chilling precision. This wasn't just a drowning. This was a message. A warning. And Marcus Hall, jaded or not, knew he had just been handed a truth too dangerous to ignore. He pushed his chair back, the plastic wheels squealing faintly on the linoleum, his gaze already fixed on the next move. He knew exactly where he needed to go.
Chapter 2. Ripples Beneath the Surface.
The mahogany desk gleamed under the recessed lights of Richard Sterling's executive office. It was a room that spoke of inherited wealth, of power meticulously cultivated. Marcus watched Sterling, a man whose grief seemed less a raw, open wound and more a perfectly tailored suit cut for public consumption. He wondered if the man ever truly shed the layers, if he ever let his guard fall. "Thank you for coming, Detective Hall, Detective Petrova." Sterling's voice was a low, controlled rumble. He gestured, a slight dip of his chin, towards the plush leather chairs opposite his vast desk. "This is all terribly difficult." A practiced sigh escaped him. Marcus leaned forward, his gaze steady, unwavering. "Mr. Sterling, we understand this is a painful time," he said, his tone even. "We just need to clarify a few details regarding Chloe's last known movements." He watched Sterling's eyes for any flicker of discomfort. Before Sterling could respond, a lean man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit detached himself from the window. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a predator. "Detective, with all due respect," the lawyer began, his voice smooth, "my client has already provided a full statement to the initial responders." He paused, letting the implication hang. "He's understandably distraught. We're eager to put this tragic accident behind us." The words were polite, but his gaze held a steely edge, a subtle warning. Richard Sterling nodded, his eyes meeting Marcus's with an unsettling, almost serene calm. "Indeed," he affirmed. "My daughter was spirited, prone to late-night walks." He cleared his throat. "The embankment can be treacherous after a few drinks. A terrible accident." The words felt too smooth, too rehearsed, utterly devoid of the genuine tremor Marcus expected from a man mourning his child. A chill, faint and insidious, began to coil in Marcus's gut. That faint chill deepened, snaking up Marcus's spine. This is it, he thought. The anonymous tip had spoken of exactly this. A desire to bury the truth, to smooth over rough edges. Lena, ever pragmatic, flipped open her notebook. Her pen hovered. "Mr. Sterling," she began, her voice crisp. "Was Chloe experiencing any unusual stress recently? Any disputes, financial or otherwise?" Richard Sterling's gaze flickered, a brief, almost imperceptible shift to his lawyer, then settled back on Lena. "Chloe was a brilliant woman, Highly independent, he said, a careful cadence to his words. She had her moments of intensity, yes, but nothing untoward. Certainly nothing that would suggest anything other than a tragic misstep. He clasped his hands on the polished surface of the desk, his knuckles stark white. It was a micro-expression of tension, a silent scream that utterly contradicted his placid tone. Marcus felt his initial skepticism solidify, hardening into a quiet, cold conviction. This wasn't just grief, this was damage control. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Sterling," Marcus said, rising slowly. He met Sterling's gaze, then the lawyer's. "We may have further questions as our investigation continues." He ignored the lawyer's barely perceptible frown, a fleeting shadow of displeasure that crossed the man's carefully composed features. The sterile gleam of Sterling Capital's halls gave way to the familiar, slightly stale air of Chloe Sterling's apartment building. The transition was abrupt, a palpable shift in atmosphere. Inside, the apartment itself presented an unsettling tableau. It was meticulously neat, almost unnervingly staged, yet a faint, almost imperceptible scent of something metallic, like ozone, lingered in the air. Marcus's gut tightened, a cold knot forming. This wasn't the apartment of a woman who had simply stepped out for a spontaneous late-night walk. Marcus moved methodically through the rooms, his eyes scanning every surface, every shadow. He paused, listening to the quiet hum of the building, the faint creak of old wood. Lena, meanwhile, was documenting the scene with her camera, her movements precise and economical. "Marcus," she called softly, her voice low, almost a murmur. "Did the initial report mention a smartwatch? I don't see one on the nightstand, or anywhere obvious." Marcus stopped, kneeling by a tall bookshelf. He ran a gloved finger along a row of leather-bound volumes, then paused. A small, ornate silver box, clearly meant for jewelry, lay slightly ajar, its contents spilled across the shelf. But one item was conspicuously absent. "No, Lena," Marcus replied, his voice equally hushed. "Just a standard wallet and phone in the initial report, but her high-end fitness tracker, the one she practically lived in, isn't here either." He gestured. "And look at this, the dust on this shelf. Someone had wiped it clean, but only in this one spot, right around this box." He pointed to a subtle, almost invisible streak in the thin layer of grime. "Someone was looking for something specific," Marcus murmured, the implications settling heavily within him. "Or covering something up. And they did it in a hurry." The silence of the apartment seemed to deepen, weighted now with an unseen struggle. Lena's brow furrowed, her expression tight. "A hurried search," she repeated, her voice edged with skepticism. "A missing smartwatch that would log her movements and heart rate. That doesn't exactly scream accidental drowning, to me." The apartment, once a silent testament to a life lived, now hummed with unspoken questions, its pristine order a deceptive, fragile veil. Later that evening, the hushed grandeur of the Boston Public Library offered a stark contrast to the quiet urgency of Marcus's solitary work. He sat hunched over a laptop in a secluded corner, a single cup of lukewarm coffee, his only companion, surrounded by towering stacks of knowledge that felt both comforting and overwhelming. The vast digital archives of public financial records were a labyrinth, a dense thicket of data, and he was determined to find a thread, however fine. He dove into Sterling Capital's public filings, annual reports, and SEC disclosures, sifting through layers of corporate jargon and complex transactions. It was tedious work, a painstaking crawl through hundreds of pages of financial minutiae. Nothing immediately screamed fraud, no smoking gun materialized from the digital depths. Yet, the sheer complexity of Sterling Capital's structure began to prickle at his intuition. Dozens of subsidiaries, shell corporations, and holding companies, all interwoven in a dizzying display of corporate architecture. He highlighted a particularly convoluted series of offshore entities, a global web that seemed unnecessarily intricate, even for a massive hedge fund. It felt less like a functional design and more like an elaborate camouflage, deliberately constructed to obscure rather than facilitate. The next morning, the sterile fluorescent lights of Captain Davies's office felt particularly oppressive, casting a harsh, unforgiving glow. Davies, a man who had meticulously built his entire career on avoiding controversy, sat behind his imposing desk, his expression grim, etched with the weight of political pressure. Lena stood beside Marcus, her posture rigid, a silent sentinel. "Hall, Petrova," Davies began, his voice clipped, cutting through the silence. He didn't invite them to sit. "I've just come off the phone with the Deputy Commissioner and the Mayor's office." He paused, letting the names hang in the air. "The Sterling family is well connected, and they want this wrapped up. The official cause of death stands: accidental drowning. End of story." His gaze was unyielding. A familiar heat rose in Marcus's chest, a slow burn of frustration battling the cold, unyielding logic of bureaucracy. He saw Chloe's missing smartwatch in his mind's eye, the telltale wiped-clean spot on the shelf, the chilling echo of Richard Sterling's hollow, rehearsed grief. He knew what he had to say, and the cost of saying it. "Captain," Marcus began, his voice strained but firm, "with all due respect, we found some inconsistencies at the apartment. Signs of a hurried search. A missing item that could provide vital data." Davies cut him off with a sharp, dismissive hand gesture. "Inconsistencies, Hall," he snapped, his voice rising, "or your imagination running wild. This isn't some back-alley mugging. This is the Sterling family. Public relations are paramount." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. "We don't need a media circus, especially not one that suggests foul play where there is none. Close the file. Accidental drowning. Understood?" The question was not an invitation for debate. Lena's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, her eyes flicking, quick as a bird, between Marcus and Davies. She was a silent, shrewd observer of the power play unfolding. Marcus met Davies's unyielding stare, his own resolve hardening into a cold, quiet defiance. He would outwardly comply. He had to. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. "Understood, Captain," Marcus replied, his voice flat, carefully devoid of any discernible emotion. They left Davies's office, the door clicking shut behind them with a definitive thud, sealing them back into the indifferent departmental hum. The air outside felt suddenly lighter, yet heavier with unspoken frustration. That night, Marcus was back in his own small, cluttered home office, a sanctuary from the department's stifling pragmatism. The city lights outside his window were a distant, shimmering blur, a world apart. The public records of Sterling Capital were spread across his desk, highlighted sections and handwritten notes, forming a messy, determined constellation. Davies's words, a dismissive wave of institutional pressure, still echoed in his ears, but they only fueled the fire in his gut, sharpening his focus. He stared at the diagram he'd painstakingly sketched, tracing the intricate lines of Sterling Capital's subsidiaries. A particularly complex web of offshore holdings stood out like a crimson stain on a pristine white shirt. It was a red flag, subtle but undeniable, pointing to something far deeper than a simple accident. And if Chloe Sterling had been digging into her family's business, as Marcus suspected, she might have found it too. A ripple of something sinister, just beneath the polished surface of Boston's elite, and Chloe might have paid the ultimate price for getting too close.
Chapter 3. Echoes from the Past.
The stale scent of burnt coffee and a general unease hung in the small cafe, a stark contrast to the elegant Back Bay brownstones outside. Marcus watched Chloe Sterling's friend, a young woman named Sarah, nervously twist a silver ring on her finger. Lena sat opposite, her notebook open, pen uncapped. "Chloe was intense, you know," Sarah began, her voice barely a whisper. She glanced at the door, a flicker of apprehension in her eyes, then back at Marcus. Always had a project, always pushing. But the last few months it was different. Life had wound her tight, like a spring ready to snap. Marcus leaned forward, his elbows on the table. Different how? More secretive, Sarah replied, her voice dropping further. She was working late, not just on her own startup but something else. Something about Sterling Capital's old business. She said she was digging into the archives. Sarah chewed on her lip, a faint crease appearing between her brows. The silence stretched, thick, with unspoken anxieties. Marcus felt a cold certainty begin to form in his gut. Later that afternoon, in the quiet hush of Chloe's former office, Peter, Chloe's colleague, offered a similar observation. He gestured vaguely at a stack of dusty ledger books in a corner. She was fixated on the past, Marcus. Kept talking about old skeletons. Said her father, Richard, had been furious with her for it. A real shouting match, apparently. Over what, exactly? Lena pressed, her pen scratching against paper. He called it ancient history, and told her to drop it. Peter shrugged, shifting in his seat, avoiding eye contact. But Chloe, she wasn't the type to drop anything once she sunk her focus into it. Marcus's gut tightened, a familiar clench. Chloe hadn't just stumbled, she'd been hunting. He could almost feel the chill of the past seeping into the room, a damp, heavy presence. Back in his own office, the low hum of the police department's servers was a constant, almost hypnotic backdrop. Marcus sat hunched over his monitor, a half-eaten sandwich forgotten beside him, its crust growing stiff. The phrase, old business, echoed in his mind, a persistent whisper. His lower back ached, a dull throb. He started by pulling up Sterling Capital's publicly available historical documents, a dense archive of annual reports, mergers, acquisitions, and philanthropic endeavors stretching back decades. Hours blurred into a single, focused stream. The sheer volume of data was overwhelming, a testament to the Sterling family's enduring presence in Boston's financial landscape. He cross-referenced names, dates, and subsidiary companies, looking for anomalies, for anything contentious enough to warrant Chloe's relentless search. It was like trying to find a specific grain of sand on a vast beach, frustratingly slow. He wondered if the barista at the cafe had ever considered a career in data entry. Then, amidst a flood of routine news clippings from the late 90s, a small, faded headline caught his eye. It was tucked away on page 12 of a local Boston paper, a minor piece about a missing person. Vance, heiress, vanishes from Newbrook Academy. Ilara Vance, 15 years old, daughter of Senator Eleanor Vance, gone without a trace after prom. His breath hitched. He scrolled back, a sudden, sharp energy jolting through him. Newbrook Academy, a prestigious boarding school, was synonymous with Boston's elite. Its board members frequently overlapped with Sterling Capital's charitable foundations, and even some of its earliest investment funds. The connection was faint, circumstantial, but it was there, a thin, almost invisible thread stretching across 18 years. It wasn't just a coincidence, it was a cold, unsettling echo. The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing in on him. He felt a familiar, almost dangerous pull, a dark current he knew too well. When Lena walked into his office later that night, 2 lukewarm coffees in hand, Marcus was standing by the whiteboard, a jumble of names and dates already scrawled across it, a printout of the Ilara Vance article pinned conspicuously in the middle. "Still at it, Hall?" she asked, her voice raspy with fatigue. She set a coffee down, the plastic lid rattling. "I think Chloe wasn't just looking for fraud, Lena," Marcus said, his voice low, urgent. He tapped the article with a marker. "I think she stumbled onto something older, something buried. This kid, Ilara Vance, disappeared from Newbrook Academy 18 years ago. Daughter of Senator Vance." Lena's brows furrowed. Finally, she looked up, her eyes meeting Marcus's. A 15-year-old girl vanishes from an elite school with strong ties to one of Boston's most powerful families. Her voice dropped, a question hanging in the air. And 18 years later, a tech heiress from that same family is found dead after digging into their old business? She paused, a long, deliberate beat. "Coincidence is a lazy excuse, Marcus. It's too neat to ignore." She nodded, a subtle but firm movement. Show me everything. Marcus felt a familiar chill, not from the office air, but from the weight of the past settling heavy. He pushed away from the whiteboard, already reaching for his jacket. I'll start with Newbrook Academy, he said, the words a promise. It's time someone asked them about Elara Vance again. The city hum outside seemed to grow louder, a cold, insistent whisper.
Chapter 4. The Unseen Threads.
Newbrook Academy's granite facade loomed, a monument to generations of inherited wealth. Its sheer bulk spoke of an enduring, almost defiant presence. Marcus parked his unmarked sedan amidst a gleaming fleet of luxury cars, the familiar weight of his badge pressing against his ribs. The autumn air bit at his cheeks, sharp and clean, but he knew a deeper, more insidious chill waited inside. He pushed through massive oak doors. The hallowed halls swallowed the sound, leaving only the hollow echo of his own footsteps. He was directed to the administration office, a space of polished mahogany in hushed tones. A woman with a perfectly coiffed silver bob, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes, introduced herself as Ms. Albright, the head administrator. Marcus explained his purpose. A routine follow-up on Elara Vance, an old missing persons case. Ms. Albright's smile remained fixed, a mask, but a subtle tightening in her shoulders did not escape Marcus's notice. Ah, Elara Vance, Ms. Albright began, her voice smooth, almost practiced. She gestured towards a plush visitor's chair. A tragedy, of course. Such a bright girl. Her gaze drifted, then refocused on him. We've cooperated fully with all inquiries over the years, Detective. Everything we have is in the archives, naturally. Her tone was helpful, yet utterly unyielding, a masterclass in polite obstruction. Marcus pressed for details, for any anomalies in Elara's records, anything that might have seemed out of place in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Ms. Albright maintained her composed front, offering only vague recollections and assurances that Newbrook had been thoroughly transparent. It was like speaking to a well-oiled machine. Eventually, Marcus was granted access to the archives, a cavernous, dust-scented room tucked away in the oldest part of the building. An elderly woman with spectacles perched on her nose, Mrs. Finch, presided over the stacks, her movements slow and deliberate. She seemed startled by Marcus's presence, her eyes darting nervously towards the ornate door before settling on him. "You're here about Elara, aren't you, dear?" Mrs. Finch whispered, her voice reedy, barely above the rustle of old paper. Marcus confirmed it, explaining his renewed interest. He watched her carefully, sensing a tremor beneath her polite facade, a fragile fear. She pulled out a slim, worn folder marked, Vance, Elara. The contents were frustratingly sparse. As Marcus flipped through the few pages, attendance records, a few unremarkable grade reports, Mrs. Finch leaned in, her voice dropping further. Elara, she was a keen one, too curious perhaps. Her gaze flickered to the distant, dark wood door at the end of the archive hall. Always asking questions, poking around where she shouldn't. A sigh escaped her, thin as smoke. She spoke of a secret club. Met in the old alumni hall, she said. Never saw much activity there myself, but Elara, she had a way of finding things. Just as Marcus leaned closer, a sharp cough echoed from the doorway. Ms. Albright stood there, her smile now noticeably strained. "Everything all right, Mrs. Finch? Detective, I trust you've found what you needed. We have other visitors arriving shortly, I'm afraid." Her tone was polite, but the message was a blunt command. Time to go. Mrs. Finch visibly recoiled, her lips pressing into a thin line, her eyes wide with a fear Marcus had no trouble deciphering. He thanked her, a silent promise in his gaze, and then turned to Ms. Albright, offering a polite but firm, "Thank you for your time, Ms. Albright. I think I have enough for now." As he walked out, the words "secret club" and "old alumni hall" resonated in his mind, confirming his suspicion that Elara's disappearance was tied to something far more sinister than a simple runaway. Back in Boston, Lena Petrova was deep in the labyrinthine depths of the Public Records Office. surrounded by stacks of old ledgers and microfiche. The air was thick with the scent of aged paper and institutional dust. Marcus's hunch about an old money connection had sent her down a rabbit hole of historical property deeds, foundation charters, and board meeting minutes. She cross-referenced names, institutions, and dates, her fingers flying across the keyboard, her brow furrowed in concentration. Initially, the task felt like sifting through endless grains of sand, a tedious exercise in bureaucratic archaeology. But then, a pattern began to emerge. First, a few familiar surnames, Sterling, Caldwell, Vance, appearing on the Newbrook Academy Board of Trustees. Then, those same names, or their spouses, or their children, popping up on the boards of various charitable foundations and investment groups that held significant property around the Newbrook area. It wasn't just a coincidence, it was a carefully spun web, meticulously maintained over decades. The sheer volume of interconnectedness, the way these prominent families had quietly interlocked their interests with the elite boarding school, was staggering. Lena printed out page after page, highlighting the recurring names, the overlapping directorships, the subtle but undeniable threads weaving through the fabric of Boston's elite. Marcus's intuition, she realized, had been chillingly accurate. This wasn't just old money, it was entrenched power, operating with an almost invisible hand. Later that evening, the city lights beginning to twinkle outside his office window, Marcus found Lena already there. A fresh pot of coffee brewed, and his whiteboard was covered in her meticulous notes. The fluorescent lights hummed, casting a stark glow on the growing collection of evidence. Newbrook was a dead end, mostly. Marcus began, leaning against his desk, recounting his polite but fruitless interview with Miss Albright. Then he detailed Mrs. Finch's hushed warnings, the librarian's fear palpable even in his retelling. He watched Lena's face as he spoke of the secret club and the old alumni hall. Lena nodded slowly, her gaze thoughtful. Sounds about right. Institutional stonewalling. But you were right, Marcus, about the threads. She turned to the whiteboard, tapping a highlighted name. Sterling, Caldwell, Vance, all on the Newbrook board, or their family members were. And not just Newbrook. These families. The unseen threads were now visible, taut and dangerous. Their next step was clear, etched in the grim reality of 2 lost lives. If anyone understood the depths of this particular well of power, it would be the one who had already lost a daughter to its unseen currents. They had to speak to Senator Vance.
Chapter 5. The Beacon Circle Shadow.
The polished brass plaque on the door of Suite 14C caught the muted corridor light, a quiet gleam. Senator Eleanor Vance. Marcus paused, adjusting the knot of his tie. A familiar tension tightened in his stomach, a cold, small knot. He pushed the door open. The office air was thick with the scent of old paper and expensive wood, a fragrance that spoke of both power and meticulous care. Senator Vance rose from behind a large mahogany desk. Her posture was almost unnaturally straight, her expression, a careful, practiced neutrality. Her handshake was firm. Her eyes, though visibly tired, held an unwavering intensity, hinting at deep reserves of steel. Marcus took the plush leather seat offered, sinking slightly, and began to speak. He chose his words with deliberate precision. He spoke of Chloe Sterling, the anonymous tip, and the unsettling patterns he'd uncovered. A flicker, almost imperceptible, crossed Senator Vance's face at Chloe's name. She listened, her gaze fixed on him, her stillness almost predatory. When he finished, a long silence settled between them, broken only by the distant hum of city traffic. "You believe," she began, her voice soft yet steady, "that this young woman's death is connected to Alara?" Marcus met her gaze directly. "I believe there are strands, Senator, unseen connections that link your daughter's disappearance to a much larger design." He watched her closely, searching for any sign that his words were piercing the carefully maintained facade of her composure. A slow, shaky breath escaped her, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of years. She leaned back, her eyes drifting towards a framed photograph on her desk. A smiling, vibrant young girl. Ilara. She was always so curious, too curious perhaps. Her voice was barely a whisper now, as if speaking aloud might disturb the delicate truce she'd made with her grief. Her composure wavered, just a fraction. She started keeping a journal, you know. Around that last year at Newbrook, she called it Things I Wasn't Supposed to See. Marcus's breath hitched. A journal. It vanished with her. The police looked, of course, but they said it was probably just a teenage diary, nothing important. But the lingering doubt in her eyes, the slight tremor in her voice, spoke volumes beyond their dismissal. Did she ever tell you what kind of things she was seeing, Senator? Eleanor Vance shook her head slowly, her gaze still fixed on the photograph. No. She was secretive, excited almost, like she'd uncovered some great mystery. But she swore me to silence, said she wanted to figure it all out herself first. Her jaw tightened, a new resolve hardening her features. If there is even a chance, Detective Hall, that her journal, Vance paused, her voice catching, that her truth can finally come to light, then I want to help. A flicker of hope, warm and unexpected, stirred in Marcus's chest. Back in the fluorescent glare of the BPD bullpen, the quiet intensity of Senator Vance's office felt a world away. Marcus navigated the dense cluster of desks, sidestepping a spilled coffee cup near forensics. Lena sat hunched over her keyboard, a half-eaten sandwich forgotten beside her. Marcus dropped into his own chair, the hum of the computers a familiar, constant drone. He relayed the conversation, emphasizing the missing journal and the senator's profound shift in demeanor. Things I wasn't supposed to see, Lena murmured, tapping her pen against her chin. Sounds exactly like something a smart, rebellious kid would write when they stumbled onto something big. They spent the next hour cross-referencing old Newbrook Academy alumni lists with current corporate boards. It was a tedious, eye-straining task that blurred into a dull ache behind Marcus's eyes. The pieces of the puzzle were there, he knew it, but the binding element was missing. Suddenly, a chime. Marcus's inbox. An anonymous email, subject line, Newbrook's secret. He clicked it open, his heart rate picking up. The message was short, stark, and chillingly precise. It spoke of a secret society, formed generations ago by Newbrook alumni, controlling Boston's elite. It gave a name, starkly written in the final line. They call themselves the Veritas Keepers. A shiver crawled up Marcus's spine, despite the warm air of the bullpen. But with it came a fierce surge of clarity. He finally had a name. Lena, he said, his voice low. We just got a name. Lena looked up, her eyes widening as she read the screen over his shoulder. The Veritas Keepers, she repeated, the words tasting like ash. Truth Keepers? Or Truth Barriers? They exchanged a grim look, the implications of the name hanging heavy in the air between them. Marcus felt a cold dread settle in his stomach, colder than the hunger gnawing at him, as he drove home through the late Boston evening. The city lights blurred into streaks, the name, the Veritas Keepers, echoing in his mind like a dark, insistent mantra. He unlocked his apartment door, the familiar click sounding unusually loud in the sudden, oppressive quiet. The air inside felt off. A faint, almost imperceptible scent that wasn't his own. He paused, senses on high alert, scanning the living room. Nothing seemed overtly out of place. No forced entry, no obvious ransacking. But the small antique silver locket his grandmother had given him, usually sitting on his bedside table, was now perched precariously on the edge of his open laptop, its chain dangling over the keyboard. A subtle, deliberate displacement. A message. A chill snaked down his spine, a primal fear he hadn't felt since his last tour. They had been here, they knew. He walked slowly to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer out at the glittering Boston skyline. The familiar city, usually a comfort, now felt like a vast, beautiful trap. The Veritas Keepers had stepped out of the shadows, and they weren't just watching him, they were sending a warning. He was no longer just investigating Chloe's death. He was being hunted. And if they were willing to breach his sanctuary, what had they done to hers? The answer, he realized, with a sickening certainty, lay waiting in Chloe's apartment, and he had to find it before they erased every last trace.
Chapter 6. A Key in the Dark.
The apartment, usually a sterile echo of past tragedy, felt like a puzzle box waiting for its final, crucial piece. Marcus moved with a quiet intensity, his gaze sweeping over surfaces already scoured by forensics. He wasn't searching for what they'd missed, but for what they hadn't known to look for. He ran a gloved hand along a book spine, the faint scent of old paper and dust clinging to the air. He peered behind a loose floorboard he'd already checked twice. Then, on a hunch, he even examined the underside of a small decorative sculpture, its cold ceramic smooth beneath his touch. His gut, a familiar, insistent pull, nudged him towards the innocuous, the overlooked. Chloe. Meticulous to a fault in life, would she have been just as cunning in leaving a trail? Or in the trail she'd deliberately left behind? He paused at a small, antique writing desk, tucked into an alcove. It felt out of place, a dark, heavy piece amidst Chloe's otherwise minimalist, modern aesthetic, almost a relic from another life. He ran a hand over the cool, polished wood, wondering if it had belonged to her grandmother. His fingers traced the ornate carvings. Then he noticed it, a faint, almost imperceptible scratch on the inside of one of the desk's small, locked drawers. Not a forced entry mark, but more like something had been repeatedly brushed against the wood, worn smooth by countless passes. He pulled out his lock-picking kit, a skill he'd picked up from an old mentor a lifetime ago. The first pick slipped, a tiny clink against the aged wood, and he swore under his breath. He tried again, slower, his focus absolute. A soft click. The drawer sprang open. Inside, tucked beneath a stack of old, forgotten letters. Childhood pen pals, perhaps, or just old bills, he thought, not bothering to examine them closely, was a sleek, almost invisible USB stick. No bigger than his thumbnail. This wasn't some generic flash drive. This was a specialized, encrypted device. Chloe's signature, indeed. A hot flush of triumph shot through him, a quick, almost giddy relief. This was it. This was Chloe's key. But as quickly as it came, a cold dread began to seep in. What had she hidden that required such elaborate, meticulous concealment? Back in the stark fluorescent glare of the precinct, the USB stick lay between Marcus and Lena, a tiny, silent arbiter of fate. The air conditioning hummed, a persistent, too loud drone, the chill in the air raising gooseflesh on Marcus's arms. Lena, brow furrowed in concentration, muttered to herself as her fingers danced across the keyboard. The encryption was good, he knew, designed by someone who understood digital shadows. But not unbreakable, not for Lena. After a few minutes, a small, satisfied grunt escaped her. A quiet triumph. She'd bypassed it. "It's not files," she murmured, her fingers still flying across the keyboard, a blur of motion. "It's a series of transactions, small, irregular, all routed through a dozen different ghost accounts before landing here." She pointed to a line of code on the screen, a digital breadcrumb. A dormant corporate shell, Ethelred Holdings LLC, completely inactive for over a decade. Marcus leaned closer, eyes scanning the complex data stream. "A breadcrumb trail," he said, the words a low hum of realization. She wasn't hiding a smoking gun, Lena. She was hiding the path to it. She knew they'd sweep her apartment clean, but who would bother with a few small, seemingly insignificant transfers? He paused, rubbing his chin, a new thought taking root. "Wait," he said, pointing to a pattern emerging from the data. These dates aren't sequential, they're spaced out, almost like a coded message. What if the amounts, or the dates, correspond to something else entirely? Lena merely nodded, already typing. She was always a step ahead, her mind a rapid-fire processor. Her fingers flew, cross-referencing, running algorithms Marcus wouldn't even begin to understand, translating the abstract into concrete connections. The silence in the office settled, broken only by the soft rhythmic click of her keyboard and the low hum of the server. Hours bled into one another, fueled by cold, stale coffee. Marcus stretched, his neck stiff, the fluorescent lights buzzing a dull ache behind his eyes, a tangible fatigue setting in. Then, Lena let out a sharp intake of breath, a sound that cut through the quiet. "Marcus, look at this." Her voice was tight. The transactions, when mapped against a specific historical stock index, show a distinct pattern. And the company receiving the final transfers, Aethelred Holdings, its initial incorporation date. She paused, a beat of profound stillness. It's exactly 18 years ago, almost to the day Ilara Vance disappeared. The words hung in the air, a chilling pronouncement. The evidence board, once a sparse collection of Chloe's smiling photos and a few flimsy leads, was now a dense, intricate tapestry of connections. It was a testament to Chloe's chilling brilliance and to the society's horrifying, insidious reach. Marcus stood back, his gaze sweeping from Chloe's vibrant portrait to a faded newspaper clipping of Ilara Vance, a ghost from the past. Lena had pulled up archived financial records, now overlaid with the intricate data from Chloe's USB. Aethelred Holdings, the dormant shell company, was indeed tied to a minor financial scandal that had briefly flickered across the news 18 years ago, dismissed as a mere accounting error by the powerful sterling capital. But now, with Chloe's meticulously laid breadcrumbs, the truth was sickeningly stark. Those small, unusual transactions weren't errors. They were the arteries of a vast, generational financial fraud. "It wasn't just an accounting error, was it?" Marcus said, his voice low, almost a whisper, as if afraid to disturb the air. It was more. The earlier triumph, the giddy relief of finding Chloe's key, felt like a distant, bitter memory now. It was replaced by a leaden weight in his gut, a cold, sickening certainty. The enemy wasn't just a powerful family or a secret society. It was a deeply entrenched system, a generational conspiracy woven into the very fabric of Boston's elite, invisible and all-consuming. He looked at the board, at the faces of the dead and the disappeared, and knew, with chilling certainty, that he was now directly in their sights. The silence in the room stretched, thick, with the enormity of what they had uncovered, and the terrifying scope of what they now had to face, but the paralyzing fear was quickly eclipsed by a grim, undeniable resolve. He had to go to the source, to the man who sat at the center of this generational fraud, and rip away the opulent silence that protected him. There was no other way.
Chapter 7. The Midpoint, the Serpent's Coil.
The silence in Richard Sterling's office was a heavy, opulent thing, pressing in on Marcus Hall. It stood in stark contrast to the frantic beat of his own pulse. Just yesterday, the scope of the generational fraud had become undeniable, a chilling clarity. Now, he stood on the precipice, facing its architect. Sunlight, a thin, filtered haze through heavy drapes, barely illuminated the polished mahogany and leather, casting long, still shadows that seemed to watch him. Richard Sterling sat behind his enormous desk, hands steepled, his expression, a carefully constructed mask, a man utterly in control. Marcus's jaw tightened, a quiet resolve hardening against the oppressive atmosphere. He placed a slim file on the desk, its contents, a digital footprint of dormant shell corporations and unusual, decades-old transactions. "Mr. Sterling," Marcus began, his voice steady despite the faint tremor in his hands. "We have reason to believe Chloe uncovered a pattern of financial irregularities within Sterling Capital. irregularities that appear to span nearly 2 decades, predating even her time here. He watched for any flicker, any tell, but Richard's gaze remained fixed, unwavering, his composure absolute. These transactions, Marcus continued, tapping the file, lead back to a series of shell companies, dormant for years, but reactivated in the months leading up to Chloe's death. They align perfectly with a minor scandal from 18 years ago, around the time Elara Vance disappeared. Richard Sterling finally shifted, a slow, deliberate unsteepling of his hands. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips, chilling in its control. "Detective Hall," he said, his voice low and even, "I appreciate your diligence." He paused, letting the word hang, a veiled insult. "But what you have there, I assure you, is nothing more than a series of complex tax strategies, perhaps some regrettable business decisions from a bygone era, long since rectified." His gaze sharpened. "Companies shift, merge, lie dormant. It's the nature of high finance." His eyes, cold and sharp, met Marcus's. Marcus felt a hot surge of frustration, his evidence dismissed with such casual ease, a flick of the wrist. Chloe was a bright girl, but sometimes overly ambitious. Perhaps she misinterpreted data, saw phantoms where there were only shadows. Marcus leaned forward, his patience wearing thin. "With all due respect, Mr. Sterling, this isn't a phantom. This is a pattern that links your company to events 18 years ago, and now to your daughter's death." Richard chuckled softly, the sound dry and humorless. "Detective, I understand you're eager to make a name for yourself. A high-profile case, a powerful family. It's tempting." He leaned back, the leather groaning faintly. "But chasing ghosts, especially those dressed in old money, can be costly." The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing in on Marcus, a physical weight. "Boston is a city of deep roots, detective, and those roots have a way of entangling anyone who digs too close to the foundations. Your career, your reputation, they're fragile things in a city like this. Don't mistake a family's desire for privacy for guilt." Richard's gaze held a chilling certainty, a promise of consequences that made the hairs on Marcus's arms prickle. He knew, with a cold, gut-deep certainty, that he was looking at a man who would stop at nothing to protect his secrets. The scene shifted abruptly. The sterile fluorescent lighting of Captain Davies' office felt like a harsh interrogation after the shadowed opulence of Sterling Capital. Lena sat beside Marcus, her jaw tight, a simmering frustration etched in her posture. Captain Davies, a man whose face usually reflected the shifting tides of departmental politics, was now a mask of stern, unyielding authority. "Marcus," Davies began without preamble, his voice clipped, "I've just received a formal complaint from Mr. Richard Sterling, citing harassment, unprofessional conduct, and an overzealous pursuit of unsubstantiated claims." A cold wave washed over Marcus, the grim inevitability of it all settling in his gut. "Effective immediately, you're being removed from the Chloe Sterling case. Petrova, you too. This investigation is officially concluded, ruling Chloe Sterling's death an accidental drowning." "Captain, with all due respect, that's absurd," Marcus interjected, his voice tight, a tremor of anger he couldn't quite control. "We have evidence of financial fraud, a connection to an 18-year-old disappearance, and a clear motive for Chloe Sterling's murder. This isn't accidental, and you know it." Davies slammed a hand on his desk, the sharp crack echoing in the small office. "I know what the official report says, detective, and I know what the department can and cannot afford." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. "Mr. Sterling is a pillar of this community. His family has deep pockets and even deeper connections. You've stepped on toes, Marcus, toes far too big for you to handle." He leaned back again, his gaze hardening. "Consider this a formal reprimand. Any further unauthorized investigation into this matter, any further contact with the Sterling family, and your badge will be on my desk. Is that clear?" Lena started to speak, a protest rising in her throat, but Marcus placed a hand on her arm, a silent signal to stand down. There was no arguing with Davies when he was like this. The system, once again, had closed ranks. He pushed himself to his feet, a heavy weight settling on his shoulders. "Crystal clear, Captain," he said, his voice flat, hollow. He turned and walked out, Lena following closely, the silence between them thick with unspoken anger and disappointment. Later that night, the Boston urban quiet pressed in on Marcus's small apartment, feeling less like peace and more like a tomb. He sat at his kitchen table, the scattered notes and photos of Chloe and Ilara spread out before him, illuminated by the harsh glow of a single lamp. Each face, each piece of evidence seemed to mock him, a silent chorus of what-ifs and if-onlys. He'd been so close, had felt the truth within his grasp, only to have the invisible hand of power snatch it away. He wondered if he'd left the stove on that morning, then shook his head, pushing the irrelevant thought away. The self-doubt was a bitter taste in his mouth. He ran a hand over his face, the stubble rough against his palm. Had he been naive? Had he truly believed that justice was blind, even in the face of such entrenched wealth and influence? The Veritas Keepers, the generational fraud, the two lost girls. It all felt insurmountable now. He stared at Chloe's smiling photo, a vibrant life snuffed out, and felt a crushing fatigue settle deep in his chest. What was the point? They would always win. They always had. He considered calling Lena, but what would he say? That he was giving up? That the fight was too big? The silence stretched, broken only by the distant wail of a siren, a sound that usually fueled his purpose, but now only amplified his despair. He stood, pacing the cramped living room, a caged animal, his mind a jumble of half-formed, defeated thoughts. He was officially off the case, his career hanging by a thread. He was alone. Then the shrill, unexpected ring of his phone shattered the oppressive quiet. Marcus flinched, startled, his heart leaping into his throat. He stared at the caller ID. Unknown number. He almost let it go to voicemail, convinced it was just another dead end, another taunt from the shadows. But something, a flicker of stubborn hope, a desperate need for one last chance, made him pick up. "Hall," he answered, his voice rough. A moment of static, then a voice, hushed and oddly distorted, spoke. It was male, nervous, but with an underlying current of urgency. "Detective Hall? My name. It doesn't matter. I worked for Sterling Capital, junior partner. I knew Chloe. She was digging, deeper than anyone knew." Marcus's blood ran cold, then hot. He gripped the phone tighter. Marcus's mind reeled, a sudden, blinding flash of light in the overwhelming darkness. He felt a surge of adrenaline, chasing away the despair, clearing the bitter taste from his mouth. Chloe hadn't just left breadcrumbs, she had left a map. And now, a terrified, guilt-ridden ally was offering to hand it to him. "Where?" Marcus demanded, his voice low, urgent. "Where can we meet?" The voice on the other end gave him an anonymous drop point, a coded instruction, then abruptly hung up. Marcus didn't even register the click of the phone. His gaze swept the city lights outside his window, no longer despairing, but seeing the shadows with a renewed, dangerous clarity. The weight of the world was still on his shoulders, but now, it felt different. Not crushing, but a challenge. He was off the case, sidelined, his career in tatters. This wasn't an official lead. It was a desperate plea, a lifeline, and Marcus Hall, against all odds, was ready to grab it. He snatched his keys from the table, the cold metal a jolt of purpose. The game wasn't over. It had just moved off the board, and he was about to step into its darkest alley.
Chapter 8. Cracks in the Facade.
The night air was a biting contrast to the humid tension clinging to Julian Reed's shirt. Marcus Hall stood by a rusted lamppost, its weak glow barely stirring the dust motes, his jacket collar high against the deceptive breeze. A beat-up sedan, engine sputtering, finally coughed to a stop in the furthest corner of the lot, its headlights, dull and hesitant, cut through the gloom. Marcus's hand instinctively brushed his hip, a phantom check for his own car keys. Had he locked it? He usually did, but tonight felt off. Julian emerged, a wraith in the shadows, shoulders hunched, eyes darting. Every movement screamed of targets painted on his back. "Detective Hall," he managed, his voice a reedy whisper, barely audible over the distant city hum. He clutched a worn leather satchel to his chest, knuckles white against the dark leather. Marcus offered a silent nod, acknowledging the raw terror that pulsed from Julian, yet mixed with a grim resolve. There was no room for pleasantries here, only the stark reality of betrayal and truth. Julian's hands, visibly trembling, pushed the satchel into Marcus's grasp. A small encrypted USB drive slid in alongside it. "It's all there," Julian choked out, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond Marcus, as if expecting a sniper's laser to find him at any moment. Everything Chloe found. The ledgers, the shell companies, the coded communications. He swallowed hard. She was so close. Marcus felt the unexpected weight of the satchel, a sudden chill running down his arm. He met Julian's eyes, seeing a man on the precipice, guilt and fear warring, choosing to jump for a flicker of redemption. Or trying to, anyway. Julian didn't wait for a response. He spun on his heel, fumbled with his car door, and was gone in a screech of tires and a cloud of exhaust. The sudden quiet felt heavy, thick with the weight of what had just transpired. Marcus gripped the satchel, a surge of adrenaline mixing with a profound, quiet hope. This wasn't merely a lead, it was the key. Hours later, a secure lamp cast a sterile glow over the makeshift war room Marcus had established in his apartment. Windows were blacked out, every device secured, creating an isolated bubble against the city's watchful eyes. Lena Petrova, grim-faced, was already hunched over a laptop, waiting. Marcus laid the satchel and the USB drive on the cleared dining table. "This is it," he stated, his voice low, the words heavy in the quiet room. "Everything Chloe collected." Lena's eyebrows rose, a flicker of cautious optimism in her usually pragmatic gaze. Marcus felt a familiar knot tighten in his stomach. The sheer volume of data was intimidating, a labyrinth of numbers and encrypted messages stretching before them. They began to work, a silent, focused intensity filling the room, broken only by the click of keys and the occasional soft sigh. Julian, after a tense, covert call, joined them the next day. His fear remained palpable, a faint tremor beneath his grim determination to see this through. "Chloe built a spiderweb," he explained, pointing to a complex flowchart Lena had already begun mapping. They thought her notes were random, but she had a system. He leaned closer to the screen. "These shell corporations, Veritas Holdings, Beacon Trust, they're all fronts. For insider trading, for laundering, for securing contracts that never went to bid." Lena, a natural with financial forensics, devoured the data. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, cross-referencing ledger entries with public records. Before them, the audacious scope of the scheme unfolded. Decades of illicit gains, hidden behind layers of legitimate-sounding entities, funneling wealth into the pockets of the Veritas Keepers. The apartment transformed into a command center. Coffee cups piled high, whiteboards filled with names and dates, red strings stretching between seemingly disparate dots, weaving a grim narrative. "This isn't just a few bad actors," Marcus muttered, rubbing a stiff neck. "This is systemic, generational." The scale of the corruption, its sheer brazenness, was almost paralyzing. It wasn't merely about money, it was about power, absolute and unquestioned. Then, Lena froze. Her eyes widened, fixed on a series of archived internal memos Chloe had meticulously tagged. "Marcus, Julian," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. "Look at this." The memos, dating back 18 years, detailed a minor scandal involving a Newbrook Academy endowment fund and a series of unaccounted-for investments. Buried deep within the coded references, Chloe had highlighted a name, Vance, and a cryptic note, Ilara's journal. A sharp gasp escaped Lena's lips. "My God!" she whispered, shaking her head slowly. She didn't just find the fraud, she found where it started, and why Alara disappeared. A chilling realization washed over Marcus. It wasn't simply that Alara had stumbled upon the earliest machinations of the fraud. She had documented it, unknowingly signing her own death warrant. The Veritas Keepers had silenced her to protect their nascent empire. Chloe, uncovering the same secrets decades later, had met the same fate. Julian, his face pale, confirmed it. Alara was bright, too bright. She saw things. They dismissed it as youthful indiscretion back then, but it was the foundation, the very first cracks in their system. The pieces slammed into place with horrifying clarity. They began to map the earliest connections, tracing the lineage of the fraud from its inception, through Alara's time, to Chloe's present-day investigation. The apartment wall was now a sprawling tapestry of deceit, a meticulously organized evidence board. The full, horrifying picture of the Veritas Keepers, generational fraud and murders, lay bare. Marcus stood before it, a burning resolve settling deep within him. This wasn't just a case anymore, it felt like a crusade. Meanwhile, across the city, Senator Eleanor Vance moved with quiet, calculated grace. Her office, usually a bustling hub of political activity, felt unusually serene, a stark contrast to the storm brewing beyond her windows. She sat at her polished mahogany desk, phone pressed to her ear, her voice a low, melodic hum of practiced diplomacy. "Yes, I understand the sensitivities, Chief," she said, her tone smooth as silk, yet with an underlying steel. "But I've received some troubling whispers regarding the integrity of certain historical endowments tied to Newbrook. Purely procedural, of course. Perhaps a quiet internal review is in order, just to ensure public confidence, you understand." She ended the call, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips. Her daughter's ghost had stirred, and the senator was finally ready to move beyond grief into action. She would use the very system that had failed Alara to now protect Marcus. Unbeknownst to him, the subtle shifts in the political winds were already beginning to clear some of the immediate pressures from his own department, buying him precious time. Back in the apartment, the team worked late into the night, the glow of screens reflecting in their tired but determined eyes. The sheer weight of the evidence, not just decades of corruption and murder, but a meticulously woven tapestry of influence and control, had galvanized them into a single, unified force. Marcus looked from Lena to Julian, then back to the sprawling evidence board. The facade was cracking, yes, but what lay beneath was proving to be a monstrous, hydra-headed beast, its tendrils reaching into every corner of the city's past and present. They had weapons now, undeniable proof, but the fight was far from over. It was only just beginning, and the true cost, he suspected, was yet to be tallied.
Chapter 9. The Looming Tower.
The war room hummed, a low thrum from the server, a rustle of papers. Marcus Hall felt a quiet dread, settling deep in his bones, a cold weight pressing in. The facade, as he'd thought last night, was cracking. What lay beneath, however, was far more insidious than he'd imagined. Julian Reed, pale but resolute, pointed to a complex diagram on the whiteboard. A faint tremor ran through his hand as he traced a web of shell corporations. They led, inevitably, to a single recurring name. "It's all connected," Julian murmured, his voice tight, almost a whisper. He leaned closer to the board, a finger pressing hard against a name. Chloe's final, encrypted ledger. It shows a series of payments, disguised as philanthropic donations, flowing from Sterling Capital to a subsidiary of the Caldwell Foundation. He paused, his gaze sweeping over their faces. Not just one-offs either. These are systematic, spanning decades. Lena, hunched over a tablet, a stray strand of hair falling across her face, cross-referenced the dates. "And here," she added, her finger hovering over a line of text, her voice sharp with discovery. 18 years ago, just after Alara Vance disappeared, a significant untraceable sum was transferred. The description: Project Newbrook Initiative. A cold certainty gripped Marcus, a premonition solidifying into chilling reality. He walked to the evidence board, his gaze sweeping past photos of Richard Sterling, anonymous Newbrook alumni. His eyes snagged, finally, on the smiling, benevolent face of Arthur Caldwell, the revered Boston philanthropist. Former headmaster of Newbrook Academy, a man whose public image was synonymous with integrity and civic duty. The thought felt like a cruel joke now, a bitter mockery. The Veritas Keepers, Marcus said, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. It was never just about the money, was it? It was about power, about control. And Caldwell, he's not just a member, he's the architect. Julian flinched, a visible shiver running through him. He always commanded respect, even fear at Newbrook, he admitted, his voice barely audible, but to think he was pulling the strings all along. Lena met Marcus's gaze, her expression grim. This isn't just financial fraud anymore, Marcus. Her finger tapped the tablet screen. This is a generational conspiracy, and it leads straight to him. Both Chloe and Alara, they got too close to the source, didn't they? The weight of Caldwell's influence settled over the room, heavy and suffocating. Marcus felt a dull ache behind his eyes, a familiar throb of exhaustion and dread. He knew exposing this man wouldn't just be difficult, it would invite the full, ruthless force of an entire entrenched system down upon them. A storm was coming. He met Lena's gaze, a silent agreement passing between them, a shared understanding of the precipice they stood upon. "We need more," Marcus stated, his voice firm, unwavering. Something irrefutable, something that connects him directly to their deaths, beyond the financial trails. The silence stretched uncomfortably between them. The next lead arrived, a cryptic whisper from Chloe's recovered digital files. A single line of code, almost an afterthought, pointed to an old, defunct server farm on the city's forgotten outskirts. Marcus and Lena drove there under the cover of night, the industrial landscape stark and silent, skeletal against the faint city glow. The air was thick with the smell of damp concrete and decades of disuse, a metallic tang of decay. They navigated the labyrinthine corridors, their flashlights cutting ragged paths through the absolute gloom. Marcus shivered, not just from the cold seeping into his bones, but from the unsettling quiet that swallowed their footsteps. Each shadow felt like a potential threat, awaiting presence. "She was meticulous," Lena whispered, her voice swallowed by the cavernous space, only to echo back faintly. "If anyone could hide something here, it was Chloe." Marcus found the access panel, precisely where the code suggested, hidden behind a loose floor tile. Inside, a single, ancient hard drive blinked a faint green light, a defiant spark in the dark. He carefully extracted it, the cold metal, a stark contrast to the heat of anticipation coiling in his chest. Back at the safe house, the drive proved stubbornly resistant, locked behind layers of Chloe's ingenious encryption. Hours later, as dawn began to paint the sky in hues of bruised purple and grey, Lena let out a sharp gasp. "Marcus, you need to see this." On the screen, a video began to play. It was grainy, the image wavering, shot from a hidden camera in what appeared to be Caldwell's private study, a room of dark wood and rich leather, heavy with the scent of old money and power. The date stamp read 18 years ago. A younger Caldwell sat at his desk, his face stern, impassive. Opposite him, a figure Marcus recognized as a low-level Newbrook administrator, visibly terrified, stammered. "The Vance girl, she knows about the accounts, sir. She saw the ledger. She kept a journal." Caldwell's response was chillingly calm, his voice a low, steady rumble that seemed to absorb all other sound. "Then ensure she doesn't speak of it again. Permanently. And retrieve that journal." The administrator nodded, his face ashen, and quickly, silently left. The video then fast-forwarded, skipping to a more recent date. Caldwell was older now, lines etched deeper into his face, but the coldness in his eyes remained, a constant, predatory gleam. He was on the phone, his tone clipped, devoid of warmth. "Sterling's daughter is digging. She's found the old Newbrook files. She's a liability. Handle it. Make it look like an accident." Marcus felt a surge of triumph, sharp and immediate, quickly followed by a wave of nausea that churned his stomach. The proof. Irrefutable, cold, calculating murder, ordered by a man revered by Boston. A man whose portrait likely hung in gilded halls. He wondered if Caldwell ever ate a cheeseburger, just a normal greasy one, or if everything he consumed was as perfectly curated as his public image. The sheer scale of it dwarfed everything else, a mountain range of depravity. The grim satisfaction was short-lived. Later that day, as Marcus was escorting Julian from the safe house to a more secure, undisclosed location, a black sedan began to tail them. It appeared subtly at first, then became a persistent shadow in his rearview mirror. Julian stiffened beside him, a small, choked sound escaping his throat. "They know," he breathed, his eyes wide, frantic. "They're coming for us." Marcus checked the mirror again, his hand instinctively going to the reassuring weight of his weapon. The car behind them was too close, too persistent, its grille, a hungry mouth. He swerved into an alley, tires squealing a protest against the asphalt, hoping to lose them in the narrow, grimy urban maze. But another vehicle, a dark SUV, suddenly blocked their path at the far end, like a pre-planned ambush sprung from the shadows. Two figures, burly and expressionless, emerged from the sedan behind them, moving with predatory efficiency. "Stay down!" Marcus yelled, his voice raw, pushing Julian towards the floorboards. He threw the car into reverse, slamming into the sedan with a jarring crunch of metal. Then he gunned it forward, scraping violently against the alley wall, the sound, a shriek of tortured steel. They just barely squeezed past the SUV as shots rang out, a percussive crack shattering the rear window. Glass sprayed, stinging his cheek. Julian let out a strangled cry, a sound ripped from deep in his gut, a pure expression of terror. Marcus didn't look back, focusing solely on getting them out, adrenaline pumping a frantic, desperate rhythm through his veins. They sped through the city streets, weaving through traffic, Marcus driving on instinct, until he was certain they had lost their pursuers. He pulled over in a deserted industrial park, the silence deafening after the chaos, a heavy blanket smothering the ringing in his ears. His breath hitched, ragged and shallow, his hands gripping the steering wheel, knuckles white with strain. Julian, still trembling, slowly sat up, shards of glass glinting like frozen tears in his hair. Marcus looked at him, a silent, grim understanding passing between them. They had the evidence, enough to expose the Veritas Keepers, but the brutal chase, the shattered glass, the sheer desperation of their escape, it wasn't just an investigation anymore. It was war. The silence of the industrial park was no longer deafening, but a heavy, suffocating blanket. They couldn't go to the DA, not when Caldwell's reach was so absolute. They had to strike first, and they had to do it where it would hurt the most. Marcus knew with a cold certainty that settled deep in his gut, that the time for subtlety was over. The fight had just begun, and it was time to gather their weapons.
Chapter 10. The Reckoning's Approach.
The air in the abandoned printing press hung heavy, thick, with the scent of old paper and dust. A nervous hush had settled over the small team. Marcus Hall ran a hand over the rough, cold concrete table that served as their makeshift command center. The glow of projected schematics did little to soften the grim line of his mouth. "We have the evidence," he stated, his voice quiet but firm. "But taking it to the DA or Captain Davies now is like delivering it directly into Caldwell's hands." Lena Petrova, hunched over a laptop, nodded slowly, her fingers poised. Julian Reed, pale and fidgety, clutched a mug of lukewarm coffee, the ceramic warm against his clammy hands. His eyes darted to the locked door, then to the flickering fluorescent light overhead. A small, irrelevant detail his mind latched onto, a desperate anchor. He wondered if the bulb would finally give out tonight. "They'll bury it," Lena confirmed, her fingers a blur across the keyboard, pulling up satellite images of a grand historic building. "Or worse, they'll bury us." On a secure tablet, Senator Eleanor Vance's face appeared, her jaw tight, a familiar steely resolve in her eyes. "Arthur Caldwell is scheduled to receive the Ballers, Beacon of Philanthropy, award at the Newbrook Alumni Gala next Tuesday," she said, her voice crisp and clear despite the digital connection. "It's a live broadcast. Every major news outlet will be there, every influential family in New England." Marcus leaned forward, a dangerous light entering his eyes, a muscle tightening in his jaw. "That's it then, the public reckoning." Julian flinched, spilling a little coffee. "Public?" he stammered, his voice barely a whisper, the word catching in his throat. "But the Veritas Keepers, they'll know it was me, won't they?" Lena placed a reassuring hand on his arm, a rare gesture from her. "They already know you're helping us, Julian," she said softly, her gaze steady. "The only way to truly be safe is to make sure they can't operate in the shadows anymore. Make them visible." The sheer audacity of the plan, its crushing weight, settled over them, sharpening the urgency of their preparations. For the next several hours, a taut focus filled the space, broken only by the tap of keyboards and their low murmurs. Marcus laid out the strategy, Lena quickly mapping out the logistics. Julian, despite his palpable fear, interjected with crucial insights into the gala's security and the usual movements of Caldwell and Sterling. Senator Vance offered her unique perspective on media leverage and public perception. "We need to hit them hard, with irrefutable proof," Marcus stressed, gesturing to the complex web of financial transactions Chloe had uncovered. "And we need to make sure it's broadcast to the world before they can shut it down." The plan began to take shape, audacious and perilously risky, a desperate gamble. The next evening a chill wind whipped through the narrow streets of the North End as Marcus and Lena left a late-night meeting with a contact. Their footsteps echoed on the cobblestones. Marcus felt a familiar unease, a prickle at the back of his neck that had become his constant companion since the Veritas Keepers had entered the picture, like a persistent fly. "Something's off," he murmured, the biting wind chilling his ears. His hand instinctively went to the small of his back, where his service weapon rested. Lena, always on alert, scanned the darkened storefronts. "Stay sharp," she advised, her voice low. A distant foghorn groaned, a mournful sound that did little to ease the mounting tension. A black sedan, its windows tinted, peeled out from a side alley, tires squealing, and accelerated directly towards them. "Move," Marcus yelled, shoving Lena hard towards a recessed doorway. He dove for cover just as a flurry of gunshots erupted, shattering the night. Lena returned fire, her aim steady even as bullets chipped away at the brickwork around her head. Marcus scrambled for a better position, his heart slammed against his ribs, a frantic, cold thrum. Two figures emerged from the sedan, dark silhouettes against the distant streetlights, moving with unnerving precision. "They're not messing around," Lena grunted, reloading with practiced speed. A bullet whizzed past Marcus's ear, so close he felt the displaced air. He fired back, aiming for center mass, hearing a grunt of pain from one of the attackers. The assassins pressed their advantage, forcing Marcus and Lena to retreat further into the alley's twisting turns. A cold, sharp dread sliced through Marcus as he saw Lena stumble, barely catching herself. If they failed here, if he failed to protect her, the thought was a sickening drop in his gut. They were trapped, pinned down, the scent of gunpowder acrid in the air. Just as one of the assassins moved in for the kill, a blinding flash of light and a deafening siren ripped through the night. A patrol car, drawn by the gunshots, rounded the corner, its blue and red lights flashing wildly. The assassins hesitated, cursed under their breath, and scrambled back into their sedan, speeding away into the darkness. Marcus and Lena emerged, shaken but unharmed, the echoes of the gunfire still reverberating in their ears. The sudden quiet after the sirens faded was almost worse. A heavy, ringing silence that felt like a physical weight. Later, in the secure apartment, the adrenaline began its slow, painful retreat, leaving behind a raw, hollow ache. Marcus sat on the edge of a worn armchair, a glass of untouched water beside him, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular. He still tasted the metallic tang of gunpowder. The near-death experience had stripped away any lingering illusions about the fight ahead. This wasn't just a case anymore, it was a visceral, personal war, a fight for something fundamental against an enemy willing to murder without a second thought. He thought of Chloe, of Ilara, of Julian's terrified face. He thought of all the buried truths, the lives destroyed. His own life, now irrevocably tied to this. Lena sat across from him, her own face pale, a small cut bleeding sluggishly above her eyebrow. She caught his eye, a silent understanding passing between them. "They want us dead, Marcus," she said, her voice raspy. "They'll keep coming." Marcus finally picked up the glass of water, taking a slow sip. "I know," he replied, his voice steady, a quiet certainty settling over him. "And we'll be ready." His gaze drifted from the untouched water to the small, secure tablet on the table, its screen dark, holding the blueprint of their next move. "But this time," he continued, his voice hardening, "we won't be waiting for them to come to us." He met her gaze, his eyes reflecting not resignation, but an unbreakable will, a profound understanding that the cost might be everything. The reckoning was coming, and he was ready to face whatever it demanded. It was time to put on a different kind of uniform and walk into the heart of their world.
Chapter 11. Breaking the Circle.
The air outside Newbrook Academy's grand auditorium hummed with hushed anticipation, and the distant drone of city traffic, a deceptive calm before the storm. Marcus adjusted the collar of his borrowed suit. The fabric felt stiff, unfamiliar, a stark contrast to the worn leather of his usual detective's jacket. He hated the feel of it, a costume he hadn't chosen. Beside him, Lena checked the small, almost invisible earpiece, her expression a mask of focused intensity. Julian, a nervous tremor in his hands, clutched a sleek briefcase containing their digital arsenal. "Remember the plan," Marcus murmured, his voice low, barely audible above the arriving guests. "No deviations." Julian nodded, swallowing hard. His gaze darted towards the imposing entrance, where uniformed security stood like statues. The sheer weight of their gamble settled in his stomach, cold and heavy. One wrong move. Their first hurdle was the guest list. Julian, leveraging his former insider status, approached the velvet rope with practiced ease, his forged invitation a work of art. Marcus and Lena, posing as his security detail, followed a step behind, their eyes scanning for any hint of suspicion. Marcus felt the guard's gaze linger, a prickle of unease. He kept his face neutral, a blank slate, but his grip tightened imperceptibly on the small device hidden in his pocket. A brief, tense exchange passed without incident. They were in. The auditorium lobby was a glittering cavern of old money and power, a tableau of Boston's elite. Chandeliers dripped light onto polished marble, reflecting a sea of senators, CEOs, and socialites. Marcus saw the carefully curated facade, the self-importance. He searched for the cracks. In the distance, Senator Vance moved with a somber elegance, exchanging polite, strained greetings. Richard Sterling, looking impeccably composed, commanded attention near a display of antique academic awards. And Arthur Caldwell, the evening's guest of honor, presided at the center of it all, a benign smile plastered across his face as he shook hands and accepted accolades. "He's like a king in his castle," Lena whispered through the earpiece. "Let's bring it down." Marcus allowed himself a fleeting, bitter smile. Not for long. They moved through the crowd, a river of silk and bespoke suits, towards the designated control booth at the back of the hall. Julian's intimate knowledge of the Academy's layout proved invaluable, guiding them through a service corridor, past catering staff, and finally to a small, unassuming door. Inside, the booth was dark and cramped, filled with dormant projection equipment. Lena immediately began to work, her fingers flying across the laptop keyboard, connecting their encrypted devices to the auditorium's main system. 5 minutes to showtime, Marcus announced, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Julian, sweating profusely, plugged in a small USB drive, his hands trembling slightly. "This is it," he breathed, looking at Marcus, a mix of fear and resolve in his eyes. Marcus met his gaze, offering a silent nod of reassurance. He saw the ghost of his younger self in Julian's face, the terrified hope. Marcus simply held his gaze, a silent promise. "We've come too far to fail now." The ceremony began with a flourish, a spotlight illuminating Caldwell as he approached the podium. He was bathed in the warm glow of projected Newbrook Academy crests. Polite applause rippled through the hall, a testament to his revered status. He began to speak, his voice resonating with an air of philanthropic wisdom, praising the Academy's legacy and the virtues of its alumni. "Now," Marcus commanded, his voice sharp and clear in the earpiece. Lena hit the key. Suddenly, the projection behind Caldwell flickered. The Newbrook crest vanished, replaced by a grainy black and white image. A collective gasp swept through the audience. Caldwell faltered mid-sentence, his smooth delivery dissolving into confusion. On the screen, a ledger appeared. Rows of complex numbers and coded accounts. Then, a close-up of a bank statement, highlighting a series of unusually large, anonymous transactions. An audio clip, scratchy but undeniably clear, began to play. A hushed conversation about diversifying assets and untraceable funds. Richard Sterling, in the front row, visibly stiffened, his eyes fixed on the screen, his composure beginning to crack. Caldwell, turning to face the projection, his face draining of color, attempted to regain control. "There appears to be a technical malfunction," he announced, his voice strained. But the microphone was now broadcasting the damning audio directly to the stunned audience. The images kept coming. A blurred photograph of Chloe Sterling, taken weeks before her death, her face etched with worry, flashed across the screen. Then, a map of Sterling Capital's intricate web of shell corporations, highlighting connections to offshore accounts, all linked to the Veritas Keepers, symbol a stylized owl, now prominently displayed. The audio shifted, playing a snippet of Chloe's own voice, recorded secretly, detailing her discovery of the fraud. The murmurs in the audience grew louder, evolving from confusion to stunned disbelief, then to outright outrage. Caldwell's carefully crafted facade began to crumble. He gripped the podium, his knuckles white, his eyes darting frantically around the room. Richard Sterling made a move to stand, his face a mask of fury and panic. The truth, long buried, was finally clawing its way into the light. The screen then showed a faded newspaper clipping about Elara Vance's disappearance, juxtaposed with internal Newbrook Academy documents, a board meeting minute, a coded financial transfer from the Veritas Keepers Foundation, dated just days after her vanishing. A chilling audio recording of a low guttural voice, later confirmed to be Caldwell's, ordered a cleanup and a discreet removal of Elara's journal. Chaos erupted, people stood, shouting, some rushing towards the stage, others pulling out their phones to record. Media cameras, initially there for the awards, now zoomed in on the unfolding drama, their flashes strobing wildly. Caldwell tried to shout over the din, but his voice was drowned out, raw with a desperation that shattered his benevolent image. Marcus emerged from the control booth, walking purposefully towards the stage, Lena and Julian right behind him. He grabbed a spare microphone, his voice cutting through the noise, amplified by the very system Lena had hijacked. "Arthur Caldwell," Marcus's voice boomed clear and accusatory, "and Richard Sterling. For decades you built an empire on fraud, silenced dissent, and murdered to protect your secrets. Chloe Sterling and Alara Vance were just two of your victims. Caldwell stared at Marcus, his face contorted into a mask of pure venom. The benevolent patriarch was replaced by a cornered predator. "This is preposterous," Caldwell shrieked, his voice cracking. "A malicious smear campaign? You will regret this, Inspector." He lunged forward, a pathetic, desperate attempt to strike Marcus. But security personnel, now responding to the chaos, intervened, pulling him back. Richard Sterling, seeing his world collapse, tried to push through the crowd, heading for an exit. "No more lies." Senator Eleanor Vance's voice, though tinged with grief, was powerful and resolute as she stepped forward from the front row, directly into the spotlight. "My daughter Elara disappeared from this very academy 18 years ago. They told me it was a runaway, a tragic accident, but I always knew, I felt it, deep down." Her gaze swept over the stunned faces in the audience, then locked onto Caldwell. "The evidence presented tonight," she continued, her voice unwavering, "corroborates what I've suspected for years. My daughter found something these men didn't want exposed. She paid the ultimate price." Uniformed officers, their faces grim, moved swiftly through the throng. They reached Caldwell first, his desperate struggles met with firm hands. His face, once the picture of refined power, was now a portrait of utter defeat and raw, ugly hatred as he was cuffed. Richard Sterling was apprehended near a side exit, his attempts to blend into the fleeing crowd futile. Other members of the Veritas Keepers, identified by Julian and Lena, were also taken into custody, their faces a mixture of shock, anger, and resignation. The flashing lights of news cameras intensified, a blinding, relentless assault that promised a public reckoning of unprecedented scale. Marcus watched Caldwell being led away, their eyes meeting for a final chilling moment. There was no remorse in Caldwell's gaze, only a burning, impotent fury, a silent promise of battles yet to come. A grim satisfaction settled in Marcus's stomach, heavy and complex, but it was tinged with a profound weariness. The circle, the generations-long cycle of corruption and murder, had been broken in this room, for this night. But as he looked out at the stunned, murmuring crowd, the implications of this public exposure rippling outwards, he knew this was merely the first tremor. The truth was out, a raw wound exposed for all the world to see, and the long, messy fight for true justice, for every buried secret, and every silent victim, had only just begun. The city, he realized, was about to be ripped open.
Chapter 12. The Unending Fight.
Boston, usually a vibrant sprawl of brick and glass, had been ripped open. Its seams, once meticulously hidden, now lay exposed to the harsh glare of a relentless media frenzy. Every news channel, every major paper, shrieked headlines: "The Veritas Keepers, Sterling Capital's decades-long fraud, the silent victims." Marcus watched it all unfold from a distance. The noise was a dull roar in his ears, a strange mix of vindication and a bone-deep weariness. He hadn't slept properly in weeks. A faint tremor in his hands served as a constant reminder of the toll. He rubbed his temples, a dull ache throbbing behind his eyes. Inside the courtrooms, the wheels of the legal system, once so slow and resistant to his push, now spun with furious, almost desperate speed. Preliminary hearings for Arthur Caldwell and Richard Sterling had begun. Their faces, once bastions of unshakable power, were now etched with a desperate, almost pathetic fear. Marcus watched them, a grim, complicated satisfaction tightening his jaw. A small army of financial investigators descended upon Sterling Capital, meticulously unwinding the complex, generational fraud hidden in plain sight for so long. The official ruling on Chloe Sterling's death was swiftly amended, a stark pronouncement echoing through the courtrooms and across the airwaves. It was no longer an accident. It was murder. The weight of that word, finally spoken aloud, brought a bitter taste to Marcus's tongue. a sharp, metallic reminder of the life lost to expose this rot. As the immediate chaos subsided, a heavy weariness settled. Weeks later, the initial storm of media attention had receded, replaced by the methodical grind of legal procedure. Marcus found himself in Senator Vance's private study. The room felt like a quiet refuge compared to the preceding chaos. Sunlight, muted by heavy drapes, cast long shadows across the antique furniture. In his hands he held a small, leather-bound journal, Elara's. It had been recovered from a hidden compartment in Caldwell's private study, a final, damning piece of evidence. The leather felt cool and smooth beneath his thumb, a whisper of a life. She kept meticulous notes. Marcus began, his voice low, gentle, almost a murmur. He ran a thumb over the worn leather of the journal. Elara, she stumbled onto it early. The Veritas Keepers, financial dealings. Just innocent curiosity at first. Documenting transactions, names, meeting places in this journal. He paused, a deep breath filling his lungs, the silence in the study suddenly heavy. Then the fear came, the chilling realization she was a witness. Caldwell and his inner circle made a swift, brutal decision. Not violence, not directly. A fabricated disappearance, a slow, agonizing erasure. He looked at the senator, her face tight with sorrow, a muscle working in her jaw. They wanted her gone, not dead, not in a way that would draw attention, just vanished. A ghost before her time. Senator Vance listened, her eyes fixed on the journal in Marcus's hands. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, a silver track against her aging skin, but her hand, when it reached for the journal, was steady. She was so bright, she whispered, her voice barely audible, thick with 18 years of held-back grief. Too bright for their shadows. Marcus felt a profound ache in his chest, a shared understanding of the truth's heavy price. This was the painful closure she had sought, the definitive answer to a mother's unending question. He knew it wouldn't heal the wound, but perhaps, finally, it would allow it to scar. He wondered if she'd ever truly sleep soundly again, or if the quiet would just bring new ghosts to haunt her. Later that week, a quiet bar, tucked away on a side street near the waterfront. The air outside had turned crisp, hinting at an early autumn. Marcus, Lena, and Julian sat at a secluded booth. The clinking of glasses and low murmur of conversation formed a soothing backdrop. They ordered a round of dark, strong drinks. To Chloe, Lena raised her glass, her eyes holding a glint of steel. And Elara, Julian added, his voice still a little shaky, but firm. He took a long swallow of his drink, the amber liquid warming his throat, then cleared it. Did you hear about that new place opening on Hanover? Italian, I think. Marcus clinked his glass with theirs. A silent acknowledgement of the brave women who had paid the ultimate price passed between them. And to us, he said, a faint smile touching his lips, we did good. Lena leaned back, a long sigh escaping her. It cost us though, didn't it? Everything. She ran a hand through her hair, her shoulders slumping. Julian nodded, tracing the rim of his glass. I'm still looking over my shoulder. And my old firm, they've made sure I won't work in finance again. Not in this city, anyway. He shrugged, a tired gesture that spoke volumes. Marcus looked at them both, his partners in this impossible fight. He saw the immense sacrifices, the unwavering courage etched in their faces. They can try to bury us, but they can't bury the truth, he stated, his voice quiet but resolute. He felt the weight of their shared burden, but also the deep, quiet camaraderie forged in the crucible of shared danger and common purpose. They had earned this moment of quiet understanding, this brief shared breath, before the next inevitable storm. A half-eaten bowl of peanuts sat forgotten between them, a small monument to their temporary truce. Later, alone in his apartment, the accolades felt hollow. The commendations from the department were a mere formality, their embossed seals and stiff parchment meaningless. Marcus knew that while he was praised publicly, he was also quietly resented. subtly sabotaged by those still loyal to the old power structures. He was a marked man, a target who had dared to expose the untouchables. He moved to his small balcony, stepping out into the cool night air. Below him, the sprawling city of Boston stretched out, a mosaic of light and shadow, the iconic landmarks, the historic buildings, the quiet neighborhoods. They all held secrets, layers of power and corruption that ran deeper than any single society. He had won this battle, yes, but the war, he knew, was far from over. The Veritas Keepers were damaged, their public facade shattered, but their influence, their insidious reach, would undoubtedly re-emerge in different forms, under new names. He wondered briefly if his neighbor's ginger cat was still sneaking onto his balcony for sun naps, or if it had found a new warmer spot, oblivious to the silent wars waged beneath its paws. Marcus took a deep breath, the crisp air filling his lungs. A quiet, determined sigh escaped him. He was exhausted, profoundly changed by the journey, bearing the psychological scars of battling such entrenched evil. But he was also stronger now, more resolute, a seasoned warrior. He looked out at the city, its myriad lights glittering like scattered jewels, knowing that there would always be more shadows to confront, more truths to unearth. And he, Detective Marcus Hall, was ready for them. He was ready for the unending fight.
Thank you for listening to this Soundscape Books recording. We hope you enjoyed it. Please subscribe so you don't miss our new releases. Goodbye for now.